White cop falsely accuses black woman in court, unaware she's a deadly Navy SEAL. The courthouse loomed in the heart of the city, its stone pillars worn by years of witnessing both justice and injustice. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Though grand in design, the space felt oppressive, as if the echoes of past verdicts lingered in the air like restless ghosts. Inside, tension crackled. The wooden benches were packed, some spectators craving a spectacle, others yearning for justice. Journalists perched over their notepads, pens tapping impatiently, ready to capture the day's unfolding drama. A line of uniformed officers stood at the back, their silent presence a display of solidarity, their eyes locked on the defendant. Vanessa Holloway sat at the defense table, still and composed, her expression unreadable. Her deep brown skin gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and her neatly braided hair framed the sharp lines of her blazer. She sat impossibly straight, hands lightly resting on the table, as though she were an observer rather than the woman at the center of the storm. But to those who truly looked, there was something more, an intensity beneath the stillness, a quiet power waiting. Across the room, Officer Derek Calloway lounged in his chair at the prosecution's table, a smirk playing at his lips, the look of a man who had never known true consequence. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a gleam, reflecting the authority he wielded with ease. His confidence was the kind that came from years of unchecked power. Beside him, Prosecutor Vincent Langston methodically shuffled through his notes. A seasoned legal expert, Langston was a man who pursued conviction with ruthless precision. His record was nearly flawless. He rarely lost, especially not against defendants like Vanessa. At the judge's bench, Judge Malcolm Whitmore adjusted his glasses, surveying the room with weary eyes. He had seen it all, truths buried beneath deception, lies parading as justice. He had long since abandoned the notion that justice was simple. It was a battlefield, fought with precision, patience, and power. "The court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "The state versus Vanessa Holloway." A hush fell over the courtroom. Vanessa inhaled slowly, controlled, measured. She did not look at Calloway, not yet. Instead, her gaze remained forward, fixed on the judge, the jury, the people who would determine her fate. "Prosecution, you may begin," Judge Whitmore said, leaning back in his chair. Langston rose smoothly, his voice carrying the polished authority of a man well-versed in the art of persuasion. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing with calculated ease. "This case is a straightforward example of defiance against law enforcement. On the night in question, Officer Calloway responded to a disturbance report outside a closed business and encountered the defendant, Ms. Holloway, loitering suspiciously. A ripple of unease moved through the courtroom at the word loitering, a term weighted with history, one often wielded as a weapon. Langston pressed on, undeterred. When asked for identification, Ms. Holloway became hostile and combative. When Officer Calloway attempted to de-escalate the situation, she physically assaulted him and attempted to seize his service weapon, an action that, had he not reacted swiftly, could have led to a tragic outcome. Gasps fluttered through the gallery. A woman in the back scoffed under her breath. Vanessa remained motionless, her face unreadable. Langston turned, gesturing to Calloway. "Officer Calloway is a respected member of the force, a man with 10 years of service, multiple commendations, and an impeccable record. He acted responsibly, as any trained officer would, in the face of immediate danger." At the defense table, Vanessa's attorney, Nathaniel Vaughn, stiffened. His fingers twitched against the papers before him. Langston's expression remained composed, but he knew better. Still, for now, he held his tongue. Turning back to the jury, his voice deepened with conviction. "We cannot permit disorder. We cannot condone violence against those who protect and serve." His gaze swept over the jurors, lingering just a second too long on the older members, the ones most likely to already be leaning in his favor. "We must ensure that justice prevails." With that, he gave a firm nod and returned to his seat. Judge Whitmore shifted his attention to Nathaniel. Defense. Nathaniel hesitated for half a second, then rose to his feet. His suit, though well-tailored, lacked the seasoned polish of Langston's. His movements, while steady, lacked the effortless precision of a veteran prosecutor. He was young, fresh out of law school, and he knew there were people in this room who saw that as a weakness. Then he glanced at Vanessa. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Calloway for the first time that morning. Not with fear, not with anger, but with an expression so sharp, so calculated, that Nathaniel felt his breath hitch. That's not a woman who's afraid, he realized. That's a woman who's waiting. Steadying himself, he turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice quiet but unwavering. This is not a case of lawlessness. He let the words settle. What we have before us is a story, a carefully crafted, well-rehearsed story. But like all stories built on lies, this one will crumble the moment you look too closely. Nathaniel took a measured step toward the jury box, lowering his voice just slightly. Officer Calloway claims he was forced to restrain my client, that he had no choice. But ask yourselves, why? Why would a woman with no criminal record, no history of violence, a woman simply standing on a sidewalk, suddenly attack a police officer? He let the question hang in the air. Miss Holloway will take the stand, and when she does, you will hear a very different version of events. And when the truth is finally revealed, his eyes flicked to Calloway, just for a moment, catching the faintest tension in his jaw. You will see that justice does not belong to the man with the most power. It belongs to the one with the truth on their side. Nathaniel returned to his seat. Judge Whitmore exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Very well, he said. Officer Calloway, you may take the stand. And so it began. Vanessa remained motionless, her breathing even and steady. She had seen battles before. This was just another one, and she was ready. Officer Derek Calloway strode toward the witness stand with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to being in control. His steps were deliberate, his posture rigid. With each click of his polished boots against the wooden floor, he reinforced the image of authority. As he settled into the witness chair, he straightened his uniform and cleared his throat. The smirk he had worn earlier was gone, replaced by something even more dangerous, calculated composure. He understood the stakes. More importantly, he knew how to play the game. As he took the oath, swearing to tell the truth, Vanessa finally looked at him. Really looked at him. He didn't meet her gaze, not yet, but she saw it anyway. The faint shift in his posture, the slight tightening of his fingers around the stand. He wasn't nervous. Not yet, but he would be. Prosecutor Vincent Langston approached with smooth, deliberate steps, his voice polished and measured. Officer Calloway, he began. Can you describe the events of that night? Calloway nodded. Of course. His voice was steady, his delivery flawless, like a script he had rehearsed over and over before stepping into this room. I was on patrol near 5th and Magnolia when I received a report of a suspicious individual loitering outside a closed business. When I arrived, I observed the defendant, Miss Holloway, standing alone near the storefront. I approached her, asked for identification, and instead of complying, she became hostile. When I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she lashed out, striking me in the chest and reaching for my service weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her for my own safety. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Calloway didn't react. His expression remained neutral, as though all of this was nothing more than standard procedure, just another routine encounter. Langston paced slowly, nodding. And did you attempt to calm her down before using force? Yes, Calloway responded firmly. I issued multiple verbal warnings in an effort to defuse the situation, but she refused to comply. She raised her voice, became aggressive. I had no choice but to act. Vanessa remained motionless, her eyes fixed on him, studying him, the way a strategist studies the battlefield before the first strike. Calloway was good, but not good enough. Langston turned back to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, We place our trust in law enforcement to act in the interest of public safety. Officer Calloway responded to a potential threat. His actions were justified. Langston returned to his seat, confidence radiating from him. He was certain he had done enough, that the authority of Calloway's uniform, his reputation, and his carefully polished testimony would be sufficient to sway the jury. Judge Malcolm Whitmore exhaled, then turned his gaze toward Nathaniel Vaughn. "Mr. Vaughn, your witness." Nathaniel rose slowly, adjusting his jacket. He didn't rush. The silence in the courtroom stretched, thick with anticipation. He walked toward Calloway, his footsteps light, casual, deceptively calm. Then, just slightly, he smiled. "Officer Calloway," he said evenly, "you testified just now that Miss Holloway was acting aggressively when you approached her, correct?" "Yes," Calloway replied. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly. "You said she raised her voice?" "Yes." "You said she struck you?" Calloway's jaw tightened just a fraction. "Correct. And yet," Nathaniel continued, reaching into his folder, "the medical report filed after her arrest states there were no injuries on your body." Silence. Calloway's fingers twitched. Nathaniel turned toward the jury, his voice light, almost conversational. "It's interesting, isn't it? A grown man, a trained police officer, the supposed victim of an assault. And yet, no bruises, no scrapes, no marks, not even a scratch." Calloway's expression remained impassive, but Vanessa saw it. The tightness in his shoulders, the way his hands curled ever so slightly inward. Nathaniel glanced at his notes. "The report also states," he continued, "that Miss Holloway sustained significant bruising on her arm and shoulder, as well as abrasions on her wrist." He let that linger before turning back to Calloway. "So, officer, can you clarify something for me?" His tone was pleasant, deceptively so. "Because, you see, I find it rather difficult to believe that this woman, a woman who, by all accounts, had no weapon and posed no clear threat, somehow ended up being the only one to leave this encounter with injuries." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Calloway shifted slightly, clearing his throat. "Sometimes injuries aren't immediately visible." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "So, you were injured?" "I didn't say that." Nathaniel's smile widened. "So, you weren't." Calloway hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. Nathaniel's smile sharpened. "Got you." He turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a video recording into evidence." Langston shot to his feet. "Objection. This evidence was not submitted prior to trial." Judge Whitmore raised a hand, silencing him. "Overruled. Let's see the footage." The bailiff took the USB drive from Nathaniel and inserted it into the courtroom's display system. The screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy but clear, a bystander's cell phone recording. The jury watched as Calloway approached Vanessa, his flashlight shining directly into her face. His voice, sharp and commanding, echoed through the speakers. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa's voice responded, calm but firm. "I'm checking directions. Show me your ID." "Did I do something wrong?" Calloway's voice hardened. "You don't get to ask questions. Show me your ID." The video showed Calloway grabbing her arm before she even had a chance to move. Vanessa's voice again. "Let go of me." And then his voice. Words that hadn't appeared in any report. "Women like you don't get to question me." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. On the stand, Calloway's face drained of color. The tension in the room shifted, snapped. Calloway sat frozen, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. Nathaniel turned back to him, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "That's what you said, isn't it?" Calloway didn't answer. Nathaniel turned toward the jury. "I rest my case." Judge Whitmore exhaled heavily. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. We will reconvene at 9 a.m. The gavel struck, but the echoes weren't nearly loud enough to drown out the whispers that followed. Vanessa rose slowly. For the briefest moment, her eyes met Calloway's. He looked away first. She walked past him without a word. Outside, the air was crisp and cool. The sky had begun to darken, streaks of orange and violet stretching across the horizon. Nathaniel caught up with her. That video, it destroyed him. Vanessa kept her eyes forward, her voice steady. It's just the beginning. Nathaniel frowned. You're holding something back. She didn't answer at first. Then softly, meet me at my house tonight. I'll tell you everything. And with that, she walked away, leaving the weight of her words hanging between them. Tomorrow, the truth wouldn't just shake the courtroom. It would burn it to the ground. Nathaniel Vaughn pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he stepped out of his car, the cool night air biting at his skin. The town was quiet at this hour, the streets nearly empty, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light in the distance. He glanced up at the house before him, a modest, well-kept home on the outskirts of town, surrounded by towering oaks swaying gently in the wind.
No flashy decorations. No unnecessary embellishments.
Everything about it was simple, purposeful, much like the woman who lived inside. Vanessa Holloway stood in the doorway before he even had a chance to knock, as if she had been expecting him. She was no longer in her sharp courtroom attire. Instead, she wore a fitted navy sweatshirt and black leggings, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. Even in casual clothing, she carried herself with the same quiet authority, her posture straight, her gaze steady. "Come in," she said simply, stepping aside. Nathaniel hesitated for only a second before crossing the threshold. The inside of her home was just as he had imagined, neat, disciplined, devoid of excess. The furniture was simple, practical, but the room itself told a story. His eyes landed on a framed photograph resting on a small side table, a younger Vanessa, standing tall in a navy uniform, her arm draped around an older man in a matching uniform. Beside it, a folded American flag sat encased in glass. Nearby, a bookshelf lined with titles on leadership, history, and military strategy confirmed what Nathaniel had already suspected. Vanessa Holloway had never truly left the battlefield. "You live alone?" he asked, more as an observation than an actual question. "For now," she replied simply. She gestured to the couch and he sat, placing his briefcase at his feet. She didn't offer him a drink, and he hadn't expected one. "I'm here for answers, Vanessa," he said finally, his voice quieter now that they were no longer surrounded by the constant hum of the courtroom.
No distractions.
"No games. I need to know what you're holding back." She studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Fair enough." She moved toward a nearby bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound folder. The edges were slightly worn, as though it had been opened and closed countless times, but the contents inside were well preserved. She placed it on the coffee table between them and sat across from him. Nathaniel reached for it, his fingers grazing the leather before carefully opening it. His breath caught as he scanned the contents: official documents, military commendations, training records, discharge papers. Nathaniel turned the pages faster, flipping through years of history until he found it. A title that changed everything. "Lieutenant Commander Vanessa Holloway." He exhaled sharply. "You were a Navy SEAL." She nodded. "Retired now, but yes." Nathaniel stared at her, both disbelief and admiration swirling within him. "This changes everything," he muttered. He closed the folder, running a hand over his face, shaking his head. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because this case isn't just about me," she said simply. "If it were, I could have ended it already. I could have walked into that courtroom on day one and told them exactly who I was. You saw Calloway today. He barely held it together when the video played. If I dropped this on him right then, he would have cracked under the weight of it. But the truth isn't just about proving my innocence," she continued. "It's about exposing him, exposing everything he represents." Nathaniel leaned back, processing her words. "You don't just want to win," he said slowly. "You want to dismantle the entire system that protects people like him." Her lips pressed together, but there was no denying it. "Calloway isn't the first cop to lie on the stand," she said, her voice steady. "He won't be the last. But if we expose him, truly expose him, we don't just prove my innocence. We show the cracks in the foundation. We show people that the system isn't as untouchable as they've been led to believe. Nathaniel let out a long breath, his mind racing. Does he know? He asked. That you were in the SEALs? Not yet, she replied, shaking her head. But he's suspicious. You saw the way he looked at me today. He knows there's something. He doesn't know what it is, and that's what's eating him alive. Nathaniel rubbed his temples. Langston is going to lose his mind when this comes out. Let him, she said, unbothered. Tomorrow we don't just defend me. We go on offense. Nathaniel tapped his fingers against the leather folder. And how exactly do we do that? Vanessa stood, walking to the mantel where the folded American flag rested. She picked it up, running her fingers lightly over the fabric before turning back to him. We make them see me, she said quietly. Not as a defendant, not as a suspect, but as the woman who spent 20 years protecting the very freedoms that man tried to strip from me. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, like a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Nathaniel felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear, but from the sheer force of her resolve. He nodded slowly. Tomorrow is going to be a fight. She placed the flag back on the mantel, letting her fingers linger on it for just a moment before turning back to him. I've been fighting my whole life, Nathaniel, she said softly. Tomorrow is just another battle. And for the first time since the trial began, he believed without a doubt that they were going to win. The courthouse loomed in the morning mist, its gray stone exterior blending into the overcast sky. A steady hum of anticipation buzzed in the air, thick with tension and curiosity. News of the trial had spread overnight, and the steps outside were now crowded with onlookers, journalists, activists, and townspeople alike. Their breath was visible in the crisp morning air as they murmured among themselves. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Every seat in the gallery was filled. The jury, now more alert than ever, sat with their hands folded tightly in their laps, eyes darting toward the defendant's table. Officer Derek Calloway sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, his normally arrogant posture a bit more tense. His fingers drummed absently against the polished wood. The row of uniformed officers who had lined the back of the courtroom on day one now sat still, their expressions unreadable, though the silent tension between them was palpable. And then there was Vanessa Holloway. She sat tall, poised, her face unreadable beneath an air of controlled confidence. The weight of the moment rested on her shoulders, but she didn't bow beneath it. She had fought battles in far deadlier places than this, and she wasn't about to falter now. At her side, Nathaniel Vaughn flipped through his notes, the pages crisp against his fingertips. The nerves he had battled on the first day of the trial were gone, replaced by sharp focus. He knew they were standing on the precipice of something monumental. The courtroom fell into silence as Judge Malcolm Whitmore entered, his expression as unreadable as ever. He took his seat and adjusted his glasses, surveying the room before speaking. This court is now in session. His voice cut through the hushed murmurs. The defense may proceed. Nathaniel rose slowly, his footsteps deliberate as he approached the stand. Your Honor, he began, turning to face the jury. Today, the defense presents its final piece of evidence, a revelation that will not only prove my client's innocence, but will also expose the truth about what really happened the night of her arrest. The words settled like a stone dropping into deep water, sending ripples through the room. Langston leaned forward, his jaw tightening as he sensed the shift in energy. Calloway, for the first time, appeared genuinely uneasy. Nathaniel turned to face Vanessa. The defense calls the defendant, Vanessa Holloway, to the stand. A rustle swept through the courtroom. Reporters at the back adjusted their cameras, pens poised over notepads, ready to capture every word. Vanessa stood, her movements as composed as ever, walking toward the witness stand with deliberate calm. She didn't hurry or falter. Her mere presence seemed to quiet the room, as if the air itself had become heavier. She took her seat and adjusted the microphone, her dark eyes scanning the jury before resting on Nathaniel. Nathaniel stepped closer. Miss Holloway, you've been accused of resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, and attempting to reach for Officer Calloway's weapon. Are any of these accusations true? Vanessa's voice was steady and unwavering. No, they are not. Nathaniel nodded. Let's talk about that night. Please tell the court what happened, in your own words. Vanessa took a slow breath. I was heading home after visiting a friend. I stopped near 5th and Magnolia to check my phone for directions when Officer Calloway approached me. He shined a flashlight in my face and demanded to know what I was doing there. And how did you respond? Nathaniel asked. I told him I was checking directions. Nathaniel allowed the words to settle before continuing. Did he ask for your identification? Yes, Vanessa replied. And did you provide it? I asked him first why he needed it. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Why did you ask that? Nathaniel pressed. Vanessa's gaze sharpened slightly. Because I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't trespassing, I wasn't disturbing the peace. I was standing on a public sidewalk. I had the right to ask why. Nathaniel turned to the jury. And how did Officer Calloway respond when you exercised that right? Vanessa's voice remained calm, though an unmistakable edge had begun to creep in. He grabbed my arm. The tension in the room tightened, like a noose. Nathaniel let the moment breathe before pressing forward. Did you threaten him in any way? Did you attempt to resist? No, Vanessa said simply. I told him to let go of me. Did he? Nathaniel asked. No, Vanessa answered, her voice steady. Nathaniel turned to the jury, his voice firm. Instead, he escalated. He shoved my client against his patrol car, restrained her without cause, and when she demanded to know why, he told her. Nathaniel turned sharply toward Calloway. Women like you don't get to question me. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Langston shot to his feet. Objection, he shouted. Judge Whitmore's gavel slammed down. Overruled. Calloway's face drained of color. Nathaniel continued, his voice softer but more powerful for it. Vanessa Holloway did not assault an officer. She did not resist arrest. What she did was exist, and for that, she was treated like a criminal. A heavy silence settled over the room. Nathaniel took a slow breath before delivering the final blow. Miss Holloway, he said, his voice calm but unwavering. Many in this courtroom, including the jury, may not know the full truth about you. Would you like to share that now? Vanessa sat perfectly still. Then, she leaned slightly forward. Her voice carried the weight of every battle she had ever fought. My name is Lieutenant Commander Vanessa Holloway. I am a retired Navy SEAL. I served my country for 20 years, deploying into some of the most dangerous combat zones in the world. The reaction was immediate: shock, realization, disbelief. Even Judge Whitmore's gavel seemed to hover in midair, suspended in frozen astonishment. The jury members stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Nathaniel turned to the court, his voice filled with quiet conviction. This is the woman Officer Calloway claimed was a threat. A woman trained in strategy, discipline, and restraint. A woman who has faced enemies on the battlefield and yet, in her own country, was treated as one. He turned back to Vanessa. Did you, at any point, reach for Officer Calloway's weapon? No, she said, her voice sharp and cutting through the silence. That was a lie. Nathaniel stepped back, his work complete. The courtroom was no longer on Calloway's side. He could feel the weight of their stares, the way they shifted away from him, recoiling. The silent wall of officers at the back no longer sat with rigid support. Calloway swallowed hard, his hands clenched into fists on the table. The truth had not only come to light, it had burned away every lie standing in its way. A heavy silence filled the courtroom, thick and unrelenting. The weight of Vanessa Holloway's revelation lingered in the air like smoke after an explosion, and no one, neither the jury, nor the spectators, nor even Judge Malcolm Whitmore, could escape it. At the plaintiff's table, Officer Derek Calloway sat motionless. His face had drained of color, and his once arrogant posture was replaced by a stiffness that betrayed the tension creeping up his spine. He had played his part well, painting himself as the dutiful officer, the upholder of law and order. But now, the room no longer looked at him with respect or trust. They looked at him with doubt. They looked at him with suspicion. Even the row of uniformed officers in the back, his fellow colleagues who had shown their silent support, weren't meeting his eyes anymore. Vanessa, however, sat tall in the witness stand. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the railing, her dark eyes unwavering. She had not raised her voice. She had not lashed out in anger. She had simply spoken the truth, and the truth had begun to tear Calloway's carefully crafted story apart. Judge Whitmore shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. He was a man who had presided over countless cases and had seen all manner of lies and half-truths paraded in front of him. But this was different. He looked over his glasses at Prosecutor Vincent Langston, whose confident demeanor was beginning to crack at the edges. "Mr. Langston," the judge said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had seen too much, "do you wish to cross-examine the witness?" Langston hesitated for just a moment. But in a case like this, a moment was everything. Straightening his jacket, Langston stood, clearing his throat. He needed to regain control, to shift the jury's focus before the case unraveled completely. He approached Vanessa with slow, measured steps, his hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Holloway," he began, his voice smooth but lacking its earlier sharpness, "I must admit, your testimony has been compelling." Vanessa did not respond, did not even blink, but remained impassive. "Let's be clear," Langston continued, pivoting slightly toward the jury. "You are a highly trained former Navy SEAL, a woman with extensive combat experience, someone who has faced dangerous situations that most of us could never imagine. Would you say that's accurate?" Vanessa remained steady. "Yes." Langston nodded, feigning thoughtfulness. "With all that training, wouldn't you say that an encounter with a police officer, one where you were being questioned, should have been something you could easily de-escalate?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Langston was trying to twist the narrative to make it seem as though Vanessa's composure and strength were somehow incriminating. Nathaniel tensed at the defense table, but Vanessa was already ahead of him. "De-escalation requires both parties to act in good faith," she said, her voice calm. "Tell me, Mr. Langston, if an armed man walked up to you in the dark, shined a light in your eyes, and grabbed your arm without cause, would you consider that an invitation to a conversation?" Langston's jaw tensed. He had underestimated her again. The jury's eyes were glued to Vanessa now. She continued, her words deliberate. "I used my training that night, just not in the way Officer Calloway claims. I didn't attack him. I didn't fight back. I controlled my breathing. I kept my voice measured. I stayed still because I knew that in situations like these, the truth doesn't matter nearly as much as perception. And Calloway was counting on that." Langston's jaw clenched, his fingers curling slightly at his sides. The jury was hanging on every word. He needed to pivot quickly. "So you're saying you complied?" he asked. "I'm saying I didn't resist," Vanessa corrected. "And yet, I was treated like I had." Langston exhaled sharply through his nose, but before he could speak, Nathaniel stood. "Objection, Your Honor," he said. "The prosecution is attempting to put my client on trial for having the audacity to exist." A ripple of agreement moved through the courtroom. Judge Whitmore sighed. Sustained. Langston knew he was losing control. He had one more move, one last-ditch effort to salvage Calloway's crumbling story. He straightened, turning slightly toward the jury. "Miss Holloway," he began, "I have just one final question." Vanessa waited. Langston let the silence stretch before speaking. "Did you at any point tell Officer Calloway that you were a Navy SEAL?" A calculated question, an attempt to imply that she had concealed something, that she had somehow manipulated the situation. Vanessa's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Not of amusement, but of quiet, unwavering control. "No," she said simply. "I didn't." Langston raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. "Because I shouldn't have to." And just like that, he lost. The words sank into the courtroom, pressing down on every person who had ever been judged unfairly, on every juror who had ever seen a case like this and wondered, what if it had been me? Langston pursed his lips, his frustration barely concealed. No further questions. He returned to his seat, knowing that no matter how much damage control he attempted, the case had shifted beyond his reach. Judge Whitmore exhaled, adjusting his glasses. We will now recess for deliberation. The jury filed out. Vanessa sat still, her breathing even. The waiting game had begun. Nathaniel turned to her, his voice low. You think they'll see the truth? Vanessa didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed ahead. They don't need to see it, Nathaniel, she said softly. They need to feel it. The fate of the case now rested in the hands of 12 strangers, and in that moment, the entire system held its breath. The courthouse was silent, save for the occasional rustling of papers and the hushed murmurs of those waiting. The jury had been gone for what felt like an eternity. Inside the courtroom, a palpable tension thickened the air, pressing down on every person in attendance like a storm waiting to break. Vanessa Holloway sat motionless at the defense table, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture as steady as ever. She had spent years in combat zones, waiting for outcomes far deadlier than this one. And yet, as she sat there in the stillness of the courtroom, she knew that this battle, this moment was different. Because this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. Nathaniel Vaughn paced near the defense table, his tie slightly loosened, his hands fidgeting as if they were trying to grasp some certainty in an uncertain moment. He wasn't unfamiliar with waiting, but this waiting felt heavier than any case he'd taken before. He glanced at Vanessa. She hadn't moved since the jury left. How do you do that? He muttered, barely loud enough for her to hear. Do what? She asked, her voice quiet and controlled. Sit so still. Vanessa didn't look at him. Instead, her gaze remained fixed straight ahead, locked on the closed doors where the jury would re-enter at any moment. You learn, she said simply. When you've been in enough situations where life and death balance on a single second, you learn to stop wasting energy on things you can't control. Nathaniel swallowed, nodding. He stepped forward, breaking the fragile silence. The jury has reached a verdict. A murmur swept through the courtroom as people shifted in their seats, leaning forward in anticipation. The tension grew, stretched, coiled tighter. The wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 12 jurors filed in, their expressions unreadable. Vanessa remained motionless. Nathaniel exhaled, straightening his tie. This was it. Judge Malcolm Whitmore looked over his glasses at the jury, his face impassive, though even he could feel the weight of the moment. He turned toward the foreperson, a middle-aged woman with short-cropped hair and an expression that had hardened over the past few days. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Whitmore asked. The foreperson nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The air felt thick, every breath held in suspense, waiting. The entire courtroom leaned in, every heartbeat synchronized in anticipation. The foreperson unfolded a small piece of paper, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of her words. In the case of State versus Vanessa Holloway, we the jury find the defendant. A beat of silence, a fraction of a second that stretched into eternity. Not guilty on all charges. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, a few stifled cheers, chaos. Judge Whitmore's gavel came down hard. Order. I will have order in this court. But nothing could stop the wave of emotions that swept through the gallery. Nathaniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, white-knuckled, before he finally turned to Vanessa. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering ever so slightly, the only indication that the weight she had carried for so long had finally begun to lift. But before anyone could react further, the foreperson spoke again. Furthermore, she continued, her voice carrying a different kind of weight now, we the jury strongly recommend that an immediate investigation into the conduct of Officer Derek Calloway be pursued. Silence. This time it wasn't heavy with fear or suspense. It was staggering. The words sank into the room, into Officer Calloway, who sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, his complexion paling by the second. The foundation beneath him cracked. Nathaniel turned slowly, watching as Calloway's smug composure crumbled into something fragile and afraid. Judge Whitmore nodded once, gravely. This court acknowledges the jury's recommendation and will pass the matter to the appropriate authorities for review. Calloway's hands gripped the table as if he were holding on to the last threads of his carefully constructed reality. But it was over. The truth had swallowed him whole. Vanessa stood slowly, her movements unhurried, deliberate. When she turned, her eyes locked onto Calloway's. She said nothing, but he didn't have to hear her words. In that moment, Calloway knew that the power he had once wielded so carelessly had finally been ripped from his grasp. Nathaniel touched Vanessa's arm lightly, grounding her in the present. "Come on," he murmured. "Let's go." She gave a small nod and walked past Calloway without a second glance. And the world outside was waiting. The courthouse doors swung open, and a sea of reporters flooded forward. Microphones, cameras, questions fired in rapid succession. "Miss Holloway, how does it feel to be free? Do you have a statement on Officer Calloway? What will you do next?" Vanessa raised a hand, not to silence them, but to steady them. She stepped forward, her expression calm, her voice clear. "This isn't just my victory," she said. "This is a victory for every person who has been silenced, for everyone who has been forced to endure injustice with no way to fight back." She let the words settle before continuing. "I stood my ground. I spoke my truth. And the system had no choice but to listen." A swell of voices rose in agreement, but Vanessa wasn't finished. "This isn't the end of the fight," she said. "It's just the beginning." Nathaniel watched, admiration flickering in his eyes. He had started this case hoping to defend an innocent woman, but he had ended it standing beside a force of nature. A woman who wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for something bigger, a change that had been a long time coming. Officer Calloway would face his reckoning. The system would feel the aftershocks of this case. And Vanessa Holloway? She wasn't going to stop. She had won her battle, but the war for justice was far from over. And she was ready for it. The world outside the courthouse had shifted. The crowd that had gathered, journalists, community members, activists, stood in anticipation, their eyes locked on Vanessa Holloway as she stepped into the cool afternoon light. The weight of the past few days, the trial, the accusations, the scrutiny, it all should have felt suffocating. But as she stood there, the sun finally breaking through the clouds, she realized something. She felt lighter. Nathaniel Vaughn stood just a step behind her, scanning the growing sea of cameras and microphones being thrust toward them. He could already see the headlines being written in real time, the flurry of fingers typing furiously on smartphones, capturing every second. A black woman wrongfully accused, and she fought back. Former Navy SEAL shatters false accusations in court. Vanessa Holloway walks free, but what happens to Officer Calloway? The questions came fast and relentless. "Miss Holloway, now that the jury has found you not guilty, what's your next move? Do you believe Officer Calloway will face criminal charges? What do you have to say about the department's history of protecting officers accused of misconduct?" Vanessa raised a hand, not to dismiss but to take control. The crowd quieted. She met their gazes one by one, her voice steady and clear. "This isn't just my story," she began. "This is the story of countless others who didn't have a courtroom full of witnesses. People whose voices weren't heard. People whose names never made the headlines." She let the words linger, letting them sink into the silence. "The only reason I'm standing here right now is because the truth was undeniable. Because the right people were willing to fight. But let's be honest, how many times have lies won? How many times has the system swallowed the truth whole and called it justice?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, some shifted uncomfortably. Nathaniel watched her, admiration flickering in his gaze. She had just won the hardest battle of her life, and yet here she was, turning her victory into something bigger than herself. "The truth should never be a privilege," Vanessa continued, her voice rising just slightly. "It should never depend on whether or not there's a camera recording it. It should never be something we have to fight to prove." She paused, then with unwavering conviction, added, "And I won't stop fighting until it isn't." The silence shattered like a wave. Applause erupted, cameras flashed, voices clamored for more questions, but Vanessa didn't linger. She gave a small nod and turned, walking away, not as a defendant, but as a woman who had reclaimed her power. Nathaniel followed, weaving through the press. His heart still pounded from the weight of it all. He barely caught up with her as she reached the steps of the courthouse. "You sure you don't want to soak this in for a second?" he asked, smirking slightly. "You just won." Vanessa turned to him, an almost amused look in her eyes. "Winning isn't the same as justice," she said. "And justice isn't just a courtroom decision. It's what happens next." She walked ahead toward the street, her steps purposeful, as though she already knew where she was going, even if the road ahead was still uncertain. 2 weeks later, Vanessa sat at a small cafe on the edge of town, stirring a cup of black coffee with slow, deliberate movements. The hum of conversation surrounded her, people going about their day, oblivious to the storm she had just walked through. She wasn't here to hide. She was here to plan. The fallout of the trial had been swift. Officer Derek Calloway had been placed on administrative leave within 24 hours of the verdict. 2 days later, an internal investigation was officially launched. The jury's recommendation had been impossible to ignore, the evidence too damning, the public pressure too intense. Now, the cracks in the system were starting to show. Nathaniel slid into the seat across from her, setting down a folded newspaper. Calloway under investigation for perjury and excessive force. Vanessa didn't look at it. She didn't need to. "It's happening," Nathaniel said, studying her closely. "But it's happening." She nodded. "It's a start." Nathaniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I still don't know how you do it." "Do what?" she asked, sipping her coffee. "Stay so controlled. Most people would be celebrating. You're already thinking about the next battle." Vanessa finally met his gaze. "I spent 20 years fighting wars overseas, Nathaniel," she said. "I never thought I'd have to come home and fight one here." Nathaniel had no response to that because the truth of it settled between them, heavy and undeniable. She set down her cup, leaning forward slightly. "The real fight starts now. Calloway is just one officer. There are thousands like him. Thousands of stories like mine that never made it to court." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then shook his head with a quiet chuckle. "You're going to be a problem for a lot of powerful people." Vanessa's lips curved into a small smile. "Good." She picked up the newspaper, finally glancing at the headline before folding it neatly and setting it aside. Then she stood. Nathaniel followed her lead. "So what now?" he asked. Vanessa looked out at the street, at the town that had once doubted her, judged her, nearly buried her under its weight. Then, in a voice steady, sure, and filled with the same unshakable resolve that had carried her through battlefields and courtrooms alike, she answered, "Now we keep going." She walked away, leaving the cafe behind. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, and she was ready for whatever came next. The wind had changed. It wasn't just the crisp autumn air rolling through the streets of the town. It was something deeper, something unspoken. Vanessa Holloway could feel it in the way people looked at her now, in the cautious glances from law enforcement officers who once walked with an air of invincibility. She could see it in the way ordinary people, strangers, stopped her on the street, murmuring quiet words of gratitude, of solidarity. She wasn't just Vanessa Holloway anymore. She was a symbol. She had no desire for fame. She wasn't interested in glory, but she wasn't going to waste this moment. She had spent years learning how to wait, learning how to strike when the time was right. And now, with Calloway's fall from grace unraveling in real time, the world had given her an opening. She was going to take it. 1 month later, the city council meeting room was packed beyond capacity. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras poised. Lawyers, activists, and community leaders had all gathered, waiting to hear what Vanessa would say. At the front of the room sat the police chief, stiff and unreadable, his expression carefully neutral. Next to him, A row of city officials shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew what was coming, and so did Officer Derek Calloway, seated further down the table, his face drained of the arrogance he once wore like armor. The investigation into his misconduct had expanded. Reports had emerged about excessive force, falsified reports, and patterns of racial profiling. Vanessa hadn't just won her case. She had blown open the door to an entire history of abuse hidden under layers of procedural red tape. Now, change was being demanded. Nathaniel sat beside Vanessa at the long table, his suit crisp, his jaw set. He leaned toward her and murmured, "You don't have to do this alone. I can speak first." Vanessa's lips curved slightly, just enough for him to see. "I appreciate it, Nathaniel," she said, "but I know exactly what I'm going to say." Then she stood. The room fell into silence. The cameras focused on her. The city officials braced themselves. She took a deep breath, and her voice rang out clear and strong, filling the space. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Vanessa Holloway," she began. "I spent 20 years serving this country as a Navy SEAL. I led missions that required discipline, strategy, and trust in the people standing beside me." She let that settle. "And yet, when I came home, when I was standing on a sidewalk, minding my own business, all of that, everything I had done, everything I had fought for, meant nothing because a man with a badge saw my skin before he saw my humanity." A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. "I was accused of a crime I didn't commit. I was forced to defend myself against lies, because the system is designed to protect officers like Derek Calloway, even when the truth is right in front of them." Vanessa turned slightly, locking eyes with the police chief. "This isn't just about one officer," she said. "This is about a system that enables them, a system that looks the other way, a system that allows people to abuse their power without consequence, until someone forces their hand." The police chief's fingers twitched where they rested on the table, but he said nothing. Vanessa turned to the council members. "We can't pretend this is just one bad apple. We can't ignore the fact that there were complaints against Calloway before me, and nothing was done. That's not an accident. That's a choice." She leaned forward slightly, her hands pressing into the table. "So now I'm asking you, what choice will you make?" The weight of her words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Nathaniel watched silently as the faces before him shifted. Some guilty, some defiant, but all unable to ignore the truth sitting right in front of them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, the mayor cleared his throat. "Miss Holloway," he said, his voice measured, "what exactly are you proposing?" Vanessa exhaled, steady and calm. "A full review of the department's use of force policies," she said. "An external investigative body to review officer misconduct complaints. Mandatory de-escalation training. Body cameras that can't be turned off at an officer's convenience." She didn't smile, didn't soften her stance. "And most importantly, accountability." The room buzzed with whispers, murmurs of agreement and tension. One of the council members, a woman with short gray hair, leaned forward, nodding. "We'll take your recommendations under advisement, Miss Holloway, but reform takes time." Vanessa's gaze didn't waver. "So does injustice," she said, and then, with deliberate precision, she turned her gaze back to Calloway. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. His world was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Vanessa had made sure of that, and she wasn't done yet. Later that night, Nathaniel found Vanessa on the rooftop of a downtown building, staring out over the city. The streets below were still alive with movement, the pulse of change beating beneath them. "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" he said, stepping beside her. She didn't look at him. "I didn't fight this hard just to walk away," she said simply. Nathaniel sighed, shaking his head. "You know this is bigger than Calloway now." "I know," she replied, her voice calm and assured. He studied her, watching the way the city lights reflected in her eyes, the quiet determination that never left her face. "You could go back to your life," he said. "You've cleared your name. You don't owe anyone anything." Vanessa finally turned to him, and for the first time, A small, knowing smile tugged at her lips. "I didn't fight for 20 years just to win battles, Nathaniel," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I fought to win wars." She took a breath, feeling the wind shift again. The battle in the courtroom was over, but the war for justice had only just begun. And Vanessa Holloway? She was ready for it. She always had been. Vanessa Holloway's story is more than a courtroom battle. It is a testament to the power of truth, resilience, and justice in the face of systemic oppression. What began as a wrongful arrest turned into a reckoning, not just for Officer Calloway, but for the entire system that had enabled him for years. Vanessa did not just fight for her own freedom. She exposed a pattern of abuse that thrived in silence, forcing those in power to confront the truth they had long ignored. Her victory was not merely about proving her innocence. It was about demanding accountability, about challenging the unchecked authority that so often goes unquestioned. In standing her ground, she became more than a defendant. She became a symbol of change, a force that could no longer be disregarded. But this story, like so many others, is a reminder that justice isn't simply a verdict. It's a struggle that persists long after the gavel falls. Vanessa's battle in the courtroom was only the start. The repercussions of her case would reach far beyond a single officer's misconduct. It would ignite conversations, force policy reforms, and inspire others to rise against injustice. Because the truth doesn't merely emerge, it demands to be acknowledged. And Vanessa Holloway? She was never just a victim. She was a warrior. And warriors don't stop when they win, they continue fighting. Vanessa Holloway's story is more than a courtroom drama. It stands as a testament to the power of truth, resilience, and justice in the face of systemic oppression. What began as a wrongful arrest evolved into a reckoning, not only for Officer Calloway but for the entire system that had shielded him for years. Vanessa didn't just fight for her own freedom. She uncovered a pattern of abuse that thrived in secrecy, compelling those in power to confront the truth they had long disregarded. Her victory wasn't merely about proving her innocence. It was about demanding accountability, about challenging the unchecked authority that so often goes unquestioned. In standing firm, she became more than a defendant. She became a symbol of change, a force that could no longer be overlooked. But, like so many others, this story serves as a reminder that justice is not merely a ruling. It's a battle that endures long after the gavel has fallen. Vanessa's courtroom victory was only the beginning. The ripple effects of her case would extend well beyond one officer's misconduct. It would fuel discussions, lead to changes in policy, and empower others to stand up to injustice. Because the truth doesn't simply rise, it demands to be seen. And Vanessa Holloway was never just a victim. She was a warrior, and warriors don't stop when they win, they keep fighting. Vanessa Holloway's journey is not just a legal drama. It mirrors the reality we face today. Every day, countless individuals encounter injustice simply because of who they are and how they're perceived. Racial profiling, abuse of power, and wrongful accusations aren't just fictional concepts. They are real issues that affect many communities. Vanessa's fight reminds us that truth alone is often not enough. It must be fought for, defended, and made impossible to ignore. In today's world, where misinformation spreads rapidly and power often goes unchecked, we must learn from Vanessa's resilience and approach. It's not enough to know the truth. We must be willing to expose it, to stand up against corruption, and to demand accountability. Whether in the workplace, in politics, or within the justice system, we all share the responsibility of ensuring that power isn't misused and that voices aren't silenced. The lesson is clear. Never let fear silence what is right. Change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from action, persistence, and the courage to challenge the status quo. Because justice is not freely given. It is claimed by those who refuse to be ignored. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.